delighted that you took time on this beautiful afternoon to come out. I'm Len Sylvester. I'm the interim minister here at Church of the Red Rocks. And the search process is moving right along. And so exactly how long I'll be here is anybody's guess. But I'm enjoying it very much. And it's a pleasure for me to welcome to our midst Jim Antal, the Reverend Dr. Jim Antal, author, pastor, denominational leader, retired, biker, traveler, speaker, author, and he has brought along some copies of his book, which are available at a steep discount.
Yeah. I paid the full price.
Okay. We did send the word out to some other churches and organizations, and I'm just curious who might be here from outside of Church of the Red Rocks. I know we have a couple from the UU Church. And where else?
Christ Lutheran.
Christ Lutheran. Wonderful. Welcome. Any other organization or church? Well, we're delighted. We're delighted. And Jim, you did not ask for any kind of an honorarium, and so we're not going to give you, no. This is just a small gift of appreciation for your ministry and your work.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Len. I have a prepared opening presentation for you. Might be 35 minutes, might be 40 minutes. And then I think the plan would be, I'm looking at you, Len, that we take a brief break. And then I have a less prepared, less organized things on sort of practical things your community, your church, or you as an individual or family could do. And my expectation is to have an opportunity for Q&A after each of those presentations, because they're kind of different. The second one is practical. The first one is more of an overreach, okay? So that's what we're in for, and we'll wrap up by 5 or maybe a little bit sooner than that. Does that sound good?
Good.
All right. I really want to thank you all for coming. It is a beautiful day. My wife and I, believe it or not, it's a little hard for me to even believe this. We drove from Vermont out to see our son in California, and now we're on our way back. A little crazy, huh? Yeah, so I'm not recommending that to anybody, at least not if you're 74 years old like I am. Having said that, though, we have had the best time, and just this morning we woke up at Grand Canyon, the South Rim. 2 nights before that we were in Zion. For 1 night before that we were in Death Valley, and then Death Valley they lost all the electricity in Death Valley. Good luck with staying in a hotel in Death Valley. Did I say the death part? And so we bailed and stayed in a nice place in Mesquite. Anyway, that's a little bit about my context for arriving here. And as Len said, I've served the United Church of Christ for all of my career in various capacities, including as the head of the UCC for Massachusetts, where we sort of got started in 1620. So I had 400 churches, 900 pastors, and about 90,000 folks for 12 years in that capacity. But even prior to that, when I was a local pastor in Shaker Heights and in Newton, I was already focusing my intellectual work and also a lot of speaking on climate change, climate challenge. My family are all scientists, and I went to college to be a scientist myself until I sort of took a turn and got into ethics and other things, as will become obvious momentarily. But when I started talking science, it's because I have that background. Now, before I jump into this, I just want to thank Len and Gary also, and Margaret and the others who organized this. And I'd also like us to observe a moment of silence for the war in Israel and in Ukraine that is on all of our minds and hearts. Can we have some silence? also assure you that you are not alone when it comes to people of faith wanting to engage the climate crisis. In just the past year, I have addressed over 25 such gatherings as this in 14 different states. When the climate movement began back in 2007, I would remind congregations that one of the reasons our church buildings used to have steeples, or not used to, they still do have steeples, was to alert the town should an emergency occur by sounding the alarm in the form of the church bell. Today, we've gathered here because we've all heard the alarm, and we have come together to respond to the greatest moral challenge humanity has ever faced. So let me also invite you, during the presentation, I will take no offense if I see you writing. That means that you have a good idea for a question. And the part about these presentations that I most like is responding to questions. So please don't hesitate, ask hard questions. I've already been told that there are some people who I might see sitting out here a little like this for this talk. And sorry, I didn't mean to pick on you. But I really mean it. Let's have an open conversation, because as I'll say in my talk, that's really what we need. Addressing climate change is such an enormous challenge. The topic, it's so big. The problem, it's so overwhelming. It's good to have some guidance. And so with that in mind, I'm going to break this down into 7 steps. It's not a sequence. Different people will take different ones of these steps in a different order. But I think each step is important, and actually I think each step is essential. So let me begin. First step, fall in love. Fall in love with God's creation. Now, living as you do in one of the most beautiful places in the world, falling in love with God's creation is probably the easiest of these 7 steps. Every single day, perhaps multiple times each day, I want to encourage you to take a deep breath and allow yourself to be grateful for the beauty, the diversity, and the grandeur that surrounds you. So that's the first step, fall in love. Second step, recognize the assault and realize the threat. Let me illustrate why it's urgent that we take action on the climate crisis immediately. It's been over 125,000 years since the Earth has been as warm as it was in 2023. And for the first time, the 12-month period that ended in February, just last month, for the first time it exceeded 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Now, scientists have warned that if global warming exceeds 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and it stays there, if that happens, the world's tropics will become uninhabitable. 2.5 billion people live in the world's tropics. In Maui, in Canada, and in countries around the Mediterranean, the fires have raged like a blowtorch. This past summer, the oceans off southern Florida rivaled the hot tubs in the resorts when the oceans hit 101 degrees Fahrenheit. Our oceans are warming at a rate half again as fast as we thought they were only 5 years ago. We now know that air pollution caused by the burning of fossil fuel kills almost 9 million people a year. That's more than malaria, HIV/AIDS, and tuberculosis combined. And that doesn't even include the lives lost due to the impact of increased global warming. 70% of CO2 pollution comes from the richest 20% of people in the world. Since 1950, the number of floods across the world has increased 15 times. Extreme temperature events, 20 times. And wildfires, 7-fold. A quarter of the world's population is one drought away from running out of water. The Greenland ice sheet is now melting 7 times faster than it was in the 1990s. So in other words, the past decade has been the hottest decade since records have been kept, and the past decade will be the coolest decade your children or grandchildren will ever experience. So with all of this in mind, UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres recently said, climate breakdown has begun. Our climate is imploding faster than we can cope with extreme weather events hitting every corner of the planet. Surging temperatures demand a surge in action. Pope Francis, of course, agrees. In his landmark 2015 encyclical, Laudato Si', Pope Francis wrote that we have turned the earth, our common home, into an immense pile of filth. And last year, on St. Francis of Assisi Day, Pope Francis released Laudato Deum, a follow-up to Laudato Si'. In it, he calls for the abandonment of fossil fuels, and he explicitly commends climate activists. Now, rather than offer more illustrations, let me provide some perspective. If you look back in time at Earth's climate, you'll see it's only over the past 10,000 years or so, about 400 generations, that climate has provided humanity with a stable enough pattern for people to depend upon. In fact, it's that dependable climate that allowed humanity to settle down, to farm our own food, and to live in year-round communities. Thus, civilization emerges from and depends upon a stable climate, or what I like to call the continuity of God's creation. But that continuity is now broken. Once the industrial era began, it took us only 7 generations to decreate the planet. Over the past 200 years, humanity has extracted and burned about half the oil, coal, and gas that nature took 150 million years to create. That's how the developed countries built the modern world. In doing so, a tiny percentage of us became unimaginably wealthy, profiting from the control over and abuse of resources that we had nothing to do with creating. At the same time, a majority of people worldwide are living amidst increased inequality, poverty, hunger, homelessness, lack of potable water. These injustices are all casualties of the unjust acquisition, extraction, and distribution, and profit from the energy stored under our feet. And to address these injustices, humanity must complete the greatest transition we have ever attempted, moving from our dependence on fossil fuel to a reliance on renewable and sustainable forms of energy. So what's been holding us back? As we'll see in a minute, the solutions are all available today. So why haven't politicians, industry leaders, and consumers embraced those solutions? What's been keeping us from making the necessary transition? A little history is helpful here. Way back in 1965, President Johnson received the first report on global warming. He responded by saying, I'm quoting now, "The destiny of humanity and the rest of creation are intimately linked. We flourish and we perish together." In 1970, many of us participated amidst the 20 million Americans who went to the streets. It took only a few months for Congress to pass the Environmental Protection Agency and to pass the Clean Air Act, which President Nixon signed. 2 years later, Congress passed the Clean Water Act, and a year after that, the Endangered Species Act. And it's worth remembering that in 2006, President George Bush, the former oil man from Texas, declared, I'm quoting again, "America is addicted to oil," and insisted that the United States, again, quote, break this addiction. So if presidents of both parties express these kinds of concerns, something else must be causing our inaction. And of course, there are many factors, but the driving reason we have not broken our addiction to fossil fuel is that since their inception, fossil fuel corporations have had one and only one goal: to make the most money for their shareholders each quarter. Keeping that goal in mind, here's some additional history. In 1975, when the fossil fuel corporations heard that the world was on the brink of global warming, they quickly hired the best climate scientists in the world. As early as 1977, those scientists told the board of Exxon that climate change is caused by humans burning fossil fuel, it's getting worse, and that the oceans are absorbing most of the excess CO2, but that will not continue indefinitely. A new study shows that as far back as 1977, the oil companies predicted exactly the global warming impacts we see today. But instead of releasing those reports, Exxon hired the best ocean scientists and asked them, is that true? The oceans are saving us? Is that right? And in the mid-1980s, the ocean scientists confirmed those findings. At about that same time, Exxon's engineers reported a breakthrough in their ability to drill horizontally through shale. This allowed Exxon to extract more natural gas than anyone could imagine, what we today refer to as fracking. So what did Exxon do? First, they fired those climate scientists and buried their reports. And then Exxon hired a few fake scientists, the same, literally, it's hard to believe this, the same fake scientists that had worked for the tobacco companies to convince America that smoking doesn't cause cancer. Just as those fake scientists had sown those seeds of doubt, they began to sow the seeds of doubt about whether or not climate change was real. Over the past 4.5 decades, fossil fuel corporations and their think tank partners have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on various disinformation campaigns and supporting politicians who will do their bidding. To this day, America remains the only place in the world where climate denial has any political or cultural traction. To learn more about this, I would highly recommend that you watch the documentary movie Merchants of Doubt, which thoroughly examines the issue of science denial funded by fossil fuel companies. The documentary is based on a book by the same title, Merchants of Doubt, by a friend of mine and the head of the Harvard History of Science Department, Dr. Naomi Oreskes. You can also watch a recent PBS Frontline series called The Power of Big Oil. So now that we understand the assault on God's creation, as difficult as it may be, we need to take a third step. We must allow ourselves to feel the pain. Serving as a guide for this difficult task is someone whose name I guess you probably all know, Greta Thunberg. Greta first heard about the climate crisis when she was 8 years old. What she saw while watching several educational movies affected her greatly. Looking back, she reports, and I'm quoting, "I began thinking about it all the time, and I felt very sad. Such was her pain that over the next few years, she fell into a deep depression, talked to very few people beyond her family. She stopped eating, and thus she stopped growing. Eventually, what made her begin to feel better were her parents. Greta felt that they really heard her. They didn't try to erase her pain. Instead, they demonstrated solidarity by no longer eating meat and becoming vegans. In 2016, Greta's mother showed her support by taking another, more major step. As a well-known, world-renowned opera singer, her career depended on traveling, far and wide. After listening to her daughter's critique of flying as a major contributor to the climate crisis, Greta's mother stopped flying. Because she was well known, her no-fly decision drew a lot of attention. Over the next 2 years, she and her husband would write a book about how Greta had changed them. In the fall of 2018, 15-year-old Greta Thunberg skipped school and headed for the sidewalk in front of the Swedish parliament, where she sat down holding a hand-painted sign that read, "School Strike for Climate." A few days later, others joined her. By November, just 2 months later, more than 17,000 students in 24 countries had taken part in what had come to be known as Fridays for the Future. When TEDx in Stockholm invited 15-year-old, okay, most of you have probably seen a TED Talk, right? Imagine a 15-year-old doing a TED Talk. Are you kidding me? They invited her to address their audience. She shared the pain that she had felt since first hearing about the climate crisis. She told the audience that from her study of the science, a 15-year-old, from her study of the science, it was clear that everything had to change. And she concluded by recognizing that people need hope, and affirmed that once we start to act, hope is everywhere. I want to just mention a very different example of a well-known person who recently, much to his own surprise, allowed himself to feel the pain and the cry of creation. At 90 years of age, in 2022, the captain of Starship Enterprise, William Shatner, became the oldest person to travel into space. As it turns out, the experience filled him, and I'm quoting, with overwhelming sadness. He wrote, again quoting, "Every day we are confronted with the knowledge of the further destruction of the earth at our hands, the extinction of animal species, of flora, of fauna, things that took 5 billion years to evolve, and suddenly we will never see them again because of the interference of mankind. It filled me with dread." Shatner exemplifies another one of Greta's brilliant insights. Greta tells us that hope starts with honesty. And as both Shatner and Greta exemplify, honesty involves talking about your sadness, your grief, your love of nature, your heartbreak over the fact that we're destroying God's creation. Evangelical Christian and climate scientist Katharine Hayhoe says that talking about the climate crisis may be the most important thing an individual can do. It's my experience that the smoke of grief and the fire of love are inseparable. For anyone who loves life, who loves their children, or delights in the natural world, recognizing the realities of the climate crisis will trigger grief. And as you allow yourself to experience the pain, you may find yourself feeling a new and confusing emotion. More and more people are feeling a sadness or a grief over the loss of a place they regard as home. The word for this new emotion is solastalgia. Let's make sure that our houses of worship are safe enough places for us to honestly share our grief, and by doing so, to give rise to a life of hope and action. Now we take the fourth step. For the past few minutes, I've been focusing on the importance of allowing ourselves to feel the pain. It's only natural, as you allow yourself to feel the pain, that you attend to the source of your pain. So let me share a story. It's a parable of sorts that explains what I mean when I say we need to attend to the source of our pain. Here's the story. One day, the quiet life of a village that stood at the edge of a river was interrupted by a scream. While sitting on a park bench alongside the river, a woman saw a bleeding body floating down the rapids. Several people responded. They jumped into the river, pulled the person out, and attended to that person's injuries. A while later, someone saw another body floating down the river. That person called for help, jumped into the river, grabbed the person's arm, and with help, pulled a second body from the river. Over the next few hours, the good people of this village pulled several more bodies out of the river and did their best to attend to them. The mayor called for a town meeting. And when the townspeople assembled in the town square, a teenager interrupted the mayor. She shouted out, "I'm going upstream. Who's coming with me? We need to stop these assaults. We need to confront the source of these attacks and put an end to them." Since 2011, the climate movement has been driven more and more by young people, by people of color, and by indigenous people, and all of them have been shouting, we need to go upstream. We need to focus our attention on the supply side of the crisis. And the climate movement has been doing just that. Beginning in 2011, we focused on stopping fossil fuel infrastructure from being built. Since then, not only was the Keystone XL pipeline canceled, so were dozens of other unnecessary pipelines, and hundreds of coal-fired power plants were closed. In 2012, the climate movement began to call for divestment from fossil fuel corporations. In 2013, the United Church of Christ, our denomination, led the way in this effort when the UCC passed a resolution that I wrote. We became the first religious body in America and the first national body in America to vote to divest from fossil fuel corporations. And in only 10 years' time, portfolios worth $40 trillion have purged their portfolios of their holdings of fossil fuel corporate stock. It's really hard to wrap your head around that number. Pope Francis has also recognized that it's time to confront the source of the problem. In both 2018 and 2019, he convened the CEOs of the world's largest fossil fuel corporations and tried to call them to account. And on the 5th anniversary of the release of his letter, Laudato Si', Pope Francis called on all Catholic institutions to divest from fossil fuels. Because fossil fuel companies continue to do all they can to expand their infrastructure so they can extract still more fossil fuel, they need funding. And this has birthed another supply side campaign. It goes by many names: Stop the Money Pipeline, Banking on Our Future, Defund Climate Chaos, Discredit Bad Banks. If you have money invested in JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Citibank, or Bank of America, please be on the lookout in the near future for the launch of a major campaign to stop these banks from funding the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure. As Bill McKibben says, money is the oxygen on which the fire of global warming burns. And I'm glad to answer any questions you may have about any of that. In April 2022, over 1,000 scientists risked arrest by putting their bodies on the line in over 25 countries as they sounded the alarm about the urgency and the injustice of the climate crisis. My friend, NASA scientist Peter Kalmus, was among them. He was arrested at the Chase Bank in Pasadena, protesting Chase Bank's funding of new fossil fuel infrastructure. Imagine if universities stopped accepting funding from fossil fuel companies to conduct climate research. Over 500 academics from many of the most prestigious universities have demanded just that. What if the fossil fuel industry was unable to find a PR firm or an advertising agency to spin the industry's false and deceptive narratives that seek to misinform the public? A new organization, Clean Creatives, is an effort to convince PR and advertising agencies to stop working with the fossil fuel industry. Over 65 cities, as well as the states of California and Massachusetts, have passed laws banning fossil fuel stoves, gas furnaces, and other gas appliances from new construction. Another way to weaken the source of the climate crisis is to expose the 100 elite law firms which have facilitated an almost inconceivable $1.36 trillion in fossil fuel transactions. They've litigated over 350 major cases on behalf of oil and gas corporations, and they have received nearly $35 billion to lobby for fossil fuel interests. There's an organization called Law Students for Climate Accountability, working to hold them accountable. Okay, for our fifth step, it's essential that we celebrate the progress we have made. 85% of Americans agree that we have a moral responsibility to create a safe and healthy environment for ourselves and for our children. Americans who think that global warming is happening outnumber those who think it is not happening 5 to 1. And almost 50% of Americans say that people in the United States are being harmed right now by global warming. It's so important to recognize the environmental sea change that has occurred since January 2021. Since he took office, President Biden has overturned 90 of former President Trump's deregulation actions and is working to roll back another 84. In addition, Biden has approved 79 new policies and is working to add another 75. In the fall of 2021, Congress passed the infrastructure bill that included over $200 billion for climate-related projects. And in August 2022, Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act, also known as the IRA. The $370 billion in the IRA is in the form of tax credits. If people take full advantage of this opportunity, and it seems like they are, America will invest over $1 trillion in climate and energy-related projects. In addition to that funding, the IRA explicitly grants the EPA authority to regulate greenhouse gas pollution, as well as to encourage the transition to clean energy sources from wind and solar. Here's some additional good news. Climate change is now a national security priority for the Pentagon. The Justice Department, the Energy Department, and the Environmental Protection Agency are now focusing on environmental justice, which prompted Dr. Bob Bullard, who is widely considered the father of environmental justice, to say, environmental justice is not a footnote anymore, it's a headline. Across the country, people are beginning to realize what many of you already know, that environmental justice is jobs with justice. Environmental justice is housing justice. Environmental justice is health justice. Environmental justice is indigenous justice. And environmental justice is racial justice. And here's something else we can celebrate. We can do this. We already have all the solutions we need to undertake this transition. A group of the world's top climate scientists recently issued a report indicating that by 2030, that's not very far, electricity from solar, wind, and water could provide all the electricity the world needs. And by 2035, renewable energy could also be the sole source for all the world's heating, cooling, transportation, and industry. Furthermore, another new study indicates that making this transition will pay for itself in only 6 years. Not only that, but as we make this transition, we can address economic and racial inequities. And by doing so, we will reap the benefits as well as that are far greater than the costs. So just as we're celebrating our progress, it's time for the sixth step. We need to receive God's call. Usually, when we think of calling or vocation, we think of it as something personal. God may be calling this individual to do one thing and that individual to do another. Often the mission of a congregation is shaped by individuals who effectively recruit others, we all know their names, They effectively recruit others to join them in their cause. But this is not the only understanding of calling. When we examine Scripture, a good thing to do every once in a while, it becomes obvious that God also calls communities, not just individuals. Nevertheless, in America, where our centuries-long celebration of rugged individualism persists, the idea that God might be calling a congregation or an entire town or a nation to come together and embrace a particular mission, such an idea is routinely dismissed. It's as if it never occurred to many people of faith that God might call us to join in common cause to fulfill God's mission. The call to address the climate crisis is a communal call. It's a universal call. Living as we are on the hinge of history, the climate crisis places an inescapable moral claim on our generation and therefore on each one of us. It urges our generation to make a fresh understanding of human freedom, fulfillment, vocation, and salvation. Can we accept that we are most free when we embrace our interdependence? That we are most fulfilled when we are grateful for having enough? That God's call, our vocation, is to recognize we are all in this together. And that God is offering us not just personal salvation, but collective salvation. If we can, we will create an unstoppable movement to restore creation. There was a time not too long ago when a generation of Americans and our allies recognized solidarity as a survival strategy, a time when they understood the importance of we. That generation realized that World War II placed an inescapable moral claim on them. That moral claim prompted that generation to accept a common, universal calling. More than 40 million individuals sacrificed their lives. Tens of thousands of churches converted their pristine lawns to victory gardens. Tens of millions of Americans became vegetarians so the troops would have more protein. Recognizing that civilization was at risk, people came together accepting the reality that we don't get to do what we want. We have to do what needs to be done. For this reason, and others, the young adults in that generation came to be known as the greatest generation. The God of many names is calling everyone who is alive today to recognize that our generation, no matter what generation we may be part of, our generation has a vocation, a common, universal calling. It's time for people of faith to make God's call to restore creation and advance climate justice an essential part of our identity so that we can leave a fair and stable planet for our kids and our grandkids and for all future generations. It's time for each of us to accept that we often have more influence than we recognize. It's time for us to call upon our gifts, our energy, our time, our skills, our networks, and our assets as we join with others in doing what urgently needs to be done. It's time for our generation to conjure the tireless resolve needed to reverse our current course so that we may restore our common home. Clergy, as well as every community leader, have a special role to play in inspiring their people to initiate this pivot in identity, in self-understanding, and in vocation. So now for the seventh step. It's time to engage your new vocation. Not long after the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate released its 2018 report, an op-ed piece brought just such an invitation to the readers of the New York Times. The headline was striking: "Stopping climate change is hopeless. Let's do it." After After enumerating many of the most depressing realities about climate change, the authors declare, we're perfect for the job. If the human species specializes in one thing, it's taking on the impossible. We are constitutionally equipped to understand this situation. Now, understanding is one thing, and taking action is another. We can all agree with that, I'm sure. The authors describe how spiritual practice can help us exchange some of our current habits for new practices and disciplines that have the power to be salvific. They believe that the path out of this mess will lead us to become more like the beloved community. The work that is required of us would endow our lives with some of the oldest and most numinous aspirations of humankind: leading a good life, treating our neighbors well, imbuing our short existence with timeless ideas like grace, dignity, respect, tolerance, and love. The authors continue. The climate struggle embodies the essence of what it means to be human, which is that we strive for the divine. Another good news testimony comes from climate scientist Simon Donner, a professor of climatology at the University of British Columbia. In his 2022 TEDx talk, Professor Donner invites his audience to recognize that we are living at a moment of immense opportunity, and that using our imagination is the key to solving the climate crisis. Because we are living in such anxious times, and anxiety can stifle the imagination, it's essential for us to take time to quiet down, to silence the clamor of requests that demand our attention, and then to listen to the still small voice of God. And when we do, we might find ourselves in the company of Esther, confronted with the realization that perhaps we were born for just such a time as this. Perhaps our generation was born to put an end to the interconnected systemic injustices, the subjugation of other humans who are not our color, the colonization of land that is not our own, the extraction of nature's wealth that we did not create. Perhaps God is calling our generation to recognize that we really do live, all of us, at the same address. And the number emblazoned above every door and dwelling at the moment is 422. That's 422 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is the same no matter where on earth you live. At a time of ideological division, perhaps God is calling all of humanity to unite as we recognize we really are all in this together. I believe God is calling our generation to enter a new story, a fossil fuel-free story. A story in which we join millions of others as we realign our time, our energy, our gifts, our attention, and our assets to respond to the call now heard around the world. That call can be heard in countless cities every Friday when thousands of young people are insisting that we end the era of fossil fuel. That call can be heard in the boardrooms of Exxon and other fossil fuel companies. That call can be heard in the courtrooms where fossil fuel companies, pipeline developers, and other corporate profiteers are being sued by cities, by states, and by children for violating their legal rights. And that call can be heard on university campuses when they ban the fossil fuel industry from recruiting on campus. And 2 months ago, that call was heard by the White House and by the Department of Energy when, for the first time in history, it placed a pause on a proposed plan for building new fossil fuel infrastructure. Climate activists, especially those elders affiliated with Bill McKibben's new organization, Third Act, had generated tens of thousands of signatures and were preparing the largest civil disobedience action in U.S. history. To everyone's surprise, the Department of Energy and the White House announced that the proposed liquid natural gas terminals, 17 of them, would be halted so that their impact on climate change could be evaluated. And just so you understand what that impact would be, if these liquid natural gas export terminals were built, their climate impact would be the equivalent of doubling the number of cars in the United States of America. This decision was the biggest thing a U.S. president has ever done to stand up to the fossil fuel industry. Believing that another, more just world is possible, let us become the generation that finally blows the whistle and declares, "Not on my watch." Let us begin to live into a new story, a story shaped by the unifying power of shared vulnerability, the expansive fullness of interdependence, the contagious generosity of caring for the least of these among us, and our universal calling to protect God's great gift of creation. Thank you, and let the people say amen.
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, that's a lot of stuff. First question is here, but I expect a whole lot more. All right, please, back there.
I agree with every single thing you've said.
My goodness.
Thank you for saying it. I think a lot of us are saying it. The only thing is, then what do we do? And that's probably part of your second half of this, and I appreciate that. But you started out, or at least mid-presentation, talking about the fossil fuel industry and how they're being blamed for so many things. I would suggest to all of us that the fossil fuel industry wouldn't have to produce it if we weren't demanding it. We have to curb our use of fossil fuels. And it would help if we had an alternative. I'm habituated to the gas in my car, the heat in my house, everything that's produced in my house. And I have to go back to my Wisconsin church and say, okay, way down in Sedona, they have all this solar energy. But I look around the homes in Wisconsin where we don't get anywhere near the sun we get here. And I think you're a bit optimistic to think that we'll have 100% of our energy supplied by wind and solar by 2030. It's not going to happen. It's 2024. That gives us 6 years. What are we going to do to push that forward? Because we're the consumer instead of being the producer.
So first, thank you for your candor, your question, your honesty, and your confession. That part of it, the confession. Secondly, yes, after we do some Q&A now, I have a second part that is going to directly address what you're saying. But what I do want to, I appreciate the way you lifted up the demand side, because we have been schooled, all of us, to think along the lines that you're asking about, which is how can I decrease my demand? Or another way of putting it, you didn't use this phrase, but I'm sure you're familiar with it, is what is my personal carbon footprint, right? And guess who invented the phrase and term carbon footprint? British Petroleum in 1992. And they developed a worldwide strategy to get people to look at themselves when it comes to responsibility for climate change, rather than look at the source, rather than look at the supply side. So this is you picked up on it, and I appreciate it. It's a big debate about focusing on the demand side or focusing on the supply side. You're really right to put your finger on it. The final thing I wanted to say is about Wisconsin. I come from Vermont, and my guess is Wisconsin and Vermont are about tied in terms of sunlight, right? So
Well, let's not say that this is Wisconsin. Beautiful.
Wisconsin is beautiful. I've been there many times. I've bike raced there. I love Wisconsin. But here's the thing. It turns out there's enough sun and wind in Wisconsin when I quoted earlier that we already have all the technology we need, that was a state-by-state analysis, and then he did a country-by-country analysis. So not only does every state in the United States have enough sunlight or wind or hydropower to supply all the energy that is needed for everything by 2035. Not only that, but that's also true for every country in the world. It's mind-blowing, right? It's like, yeah, right. I'm not saying you're saying that to yourself, but I've seen that and people have said that to me. And all I can say is it's true. And that's what Greta Thunberg meant when she was 15 years old and she said we have to make the greatest transition we've ever conceived of. That's what she meant. It's a big change. We'll get to that in a few minutes when I do my second part. Who has another question? Please.
Excuse me. Earlier in your talk, you mentioned the importance of houses of worship being places where people could feel and face these feelings. And I'm curious, what have you seen congregations that you've touched doing in this regard?
So thank you. That's a really wonderful question. And what I'm about to say is not just about Christian congregations, but I also have heard many examples of synagogues in what I am about to say. And the sort of easiest thing that congregations that have taken action in this way around grief and so forth have done is to invite members of the congregation once a month to have a 1-minute speak out, which many congregations do already on various issues, but a 1-minute speak out that has something to do with climate change. And for some of them, it's about grief. For some of them, it's about action. And for some of them, they do other things. But because we have once a week, we have an audience of people who really know one another, the idea that can become a trustworthy enough place where we can actually express our grief is, in my mind, one of the most valuable contributions that congregations can make to what will help facilitate true change. And I'll give a personal example about this that has nothing to do with climate change. So I was a local pastor for 20 years, 10 years in Newton, Massachusetts, 10 years in Shaker Heights. And until my final year as a local pastor, I never mentioned from the pulpit that my mother was a schizophrenic. And when I mentioned it, I think it was 8 different people, each from different families, who came up and said, that's the first time I've ever heard a personal comment about mental illness from the pulpit, and I too have a schizophrenic in my family. And they had never felt support for that dimension of their family until I talked about my mom and growing up. And so that's an example that also works with grief, if you understand what I mean in terms of your question. There's a wonderful Jewish organization around climate. Dayenu is its name. And it is doing terrific work to encourage congregations, Jewish congregations, to do the same thing. Who has another question or comment? Please.
Addressing our need, our personal need, that you had said, to help with the change. I think of the people, and I hopefully maybe you can address this in the next section, but huge communities, cities, communities, areas are affected by the need to change. And I'm calling out the Carolinas that built a lot of furniture, that their trees were gone and they lost that ability to earn a living. And the mining areas in the south, they're going to lose, and they have already started to lose, that ability. How do we address that? Because it's not just our individual change, but it's how our individual change affects a huge amount of people who have always used fossil fuels or whatever as a way of living, as their livelihood. How do we address that?
So we need to make transitions which, to your point, are local or regional, and sometimes local or regional, as in the examples that you gave, are really focused on an industry that essentially has to be put to bed. And so a great example of that is Iowa, who raise your hand if you're aware that Iowa is the largest manufacturer of wind turbines in America, right? And if you drive across Iowa, it becomes completely obvious. Now there are other places like West Virginia, for example. There is a coal mining museum in West Virginia. My family's from West Virginia, so I'm aware of this also. But what you may or may not know is that it's powered by solar power. Now, of course, I mean that as a joke, and I don't mean it as a joke. And to your point, somehow we, that is humanity, but community by community, which is your point, we have to make this transition. And so those oil workers and those pipeline workers who have all kinds of skill, they can become wind turbine workers. We just, in our trip across the country, we just drove through near Palm Springs, Florida. You go up through the pass there between the two mountains, and I don't know, for 40 years that I'm aware of, there have been the newest and oldest wind turbines installed there. There are thousands of wind turbines in that pass. Wow, there's a whole bunch of them aren't working, and the reason is because not enough workers have been trained to fix them and get them working again, you know? And so there are communities, again, to your point, that are intentionally making this transition and providing their workforce with whatever they need in order to give up what was connected with fossil fuels and embrace what could be connected with clean energy production.
Can I add something
Yes.
to that?
Yeah.
We were in North Carolina a few years ago, and North Carolina was the place for furniture because of the trees.
Yes.
And the trees are gone. Or they were at that time, maybe they're coming back, who knows. But anyway, what that little community that we went to found was that their soil, their clay, was very, pliable, that they could make beautiful pots with it. And yeah, right. So they, instead of furniture, pots, pottery.
It's a great example of exactly, we can do this. We just have to realize, as I said, it's maybe the most abrupt thing that I says is certain contexts we don't get to do what we want. We need to do what needs to be done, right? And this is an example that they could no longer do this. So, geez, maybe we could throw pots. It's a great example. Thank you. Who else, please?
Well, I've got to correct a misconception about North Carolina. The furniture industry did not move because of lack of trees. It moved because furniture owners made more money by shifting that to China and Thailand and Vietnam. There are plenty of trees in North Carolina, from ash to oak to hickory. Having lived there for 40 years, there's no dearth of trees in North Carolina, nor has there ever been a dearth of pottery. The real issue that you see in North Carolina, and I think what she's talking about, is that whenever you shift, there are trade-offs. There are winners and losers in the old-fashioned sense.
Yes.
And what we need to do is to create everyone can be a winner.
That's right. You said it so beautifully. And what else would a church, a synagogue, or a mosque be about than trying to make that transition in a way that makes everyone a winner? We call that justice, right? And that's another way in which our religious communities can and must engage what may appear like an economic thing or a regional kind of, corporate thing. It's also a moral thing that we're all engaged with. Who else had a question, please?
I did, and it's along the same lines. So keep this in mind, I'm an accountant. And some of the things you said immediately triggered the economic loss that could be suffered as a result of changing from fossil fuels to environmentally friendly fuels. So are there studies that, because we could lose, this could have a significant impact in our economy overall, because you're really, if we take out the fossil fuel companies, you were talking about the marketing side of it, you're talking about the legal side of it. I'm looking at New York, I'm thinking about attorneys out in the street trying to find jobs. So I'm worried. I'm immediately worried. How are we going to get to where we want to go? And are there studies that are being done so that we can understand that there may be a calm and reasonable approach to this, rather than shutting it off and trying to turn the other side?
So this is a terrific question, and I'm not ignoring you over here, but I have to look at her when I say what I'm about to say. Okay, can I have your permission? Okay, good. Okay, so it turns out I want to sort of make your point even more forcefully. It turns out to make the making of this transition requires fossil fuel companies to give up $100 trillion of profit that they have currently the legal right to extract oil, coal, or gas from the ground and sell at marketable prices. Their profit, if they were to do that, would be $100 trillion, and most everyone on Earth would be dead.
Say that again.
If all the oil, coal, and gas that the oil, coal, and gas companies currently have the legal right to extract were extracted and burned, it would create conditions of anywhere from 5 to 8 degrees centigrade rise. No human beings would be able to live in virtually anywhere on Earth.
But that would happen that's if it happened all at once.
That would happen over the course of at the pace of extraction. They could, and maybe if they were just given the freedom, they would extract it in a matter of a few decades. It's not a long time. So that's real. Now, the other thing that is equally real, and I'm looking at the accountant here, is what I said, that in 6 years, the transition to fossil fuel or off of fossil fuel to solar, wind, and water would pay for itself. You remember that part? Which sounds to an accountant like, wait, it pay for itself? Well, it turns out the wind and the sun, it's free. It turns out it's free. So after you have paid down your initial capital costs, spread out over roughly 6 years, after that, it's free. And it's just, like, wait a minute. You mean we've been paying all of this for gas and for oil, heat, and all of that, and we could be having like free? So that's the other side. So you got the $100 trillion on this side, you got the after 6 years, it's free on this side. And I'll just give you one more example about the pace of change, which again, being mathematically oriented, you'll really appreciate this, but most people will also. It turns out solar panels today and their cost of solar panels today is 1/400th. It's hard to even say that. 1/400th the cost of what they were in 1979 when Jimmy Carter put solar panels on the White House. In other words, solar is now 400 times more efficient than it was when Jimmy Carter put solar panels on the White House. In my own personal experience, we have 2 solar panels on our property in Vermont. They're the kind that follow the sun. They have kind of a computer in them, and it says like that. So the first one I was very happy with. We installed it in 2016. It was giving us much of, but not sufficient of our electrical needs. So then I installed another one, or I had installed another one in November. It's 40% more efficient. Are you kidding me? So it gives same size, same exact dimensions, and it gives 140% of the electricity that the other one gives. And both of them, they track the sun the same way. That's how big the change was from 2016 to 2023. That's how big the change was. Final comment about pace of change is the right now, the pace of change around battery technology, it's just insane. I'm not gonna ask for a show of hands of how many of you have all electric cars or how many of you have hybrid, mix or whatever. But here's what I can tell you, that within 3 years, you'll be able to have an all electric car that will easily be able to drive 500 miles without charging. Easy. So this notion of range anxiety, that I could ask for a show of hands on that, and my hand would go up, right? That range anxiety will be a thing of the past. You'll be able to drive more miles on a single charge than you can stay awake for, right? That's a measure, right? I've been driving across the country, so it's like in my soul right now. Okay, so those are all relevant to your concern. So I'm not dismissing. I love accountants. I'm like, I went to school to be a mathematician. Okay, so yeah. Okay, should I go on with the other part? I'm looking at the time. And go ahead. We have the first, you get the last, and then I'll go on.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
And then we'll come back. We'll have final Q&A at the end. Go ahead, please.
I can remember sometime in the 70s, maybe early 80s, I can remember when Paul Ehrlich wrote
Yes.
Population Bomb.
Yep.
And he was talking about, the thing I liked about that book was it gave a lot of statistics, which may have changed by now, but talking about how much more a child born in this country will use in terms of energy or any other consumption of any natural resource than a child born in Italy or, well, not so much Italy, in India.
Congo.
Or, yeah. But I also note that today we have Americans saying, oh yeah, but it's not our problem. Look what they're doing in China. And what I would say is we're still consuming more than the average Chinese.
Way.
Yeah. Okay, so I just wanted to add that to the
All
conversation.
those, everything you said is accurate, and all those dimensions are relevant. And it's also relevant what I said, that we all have 422 parts per million of CO2. That's not like over one country and then this country is 350 over here, everything's gonna be fine there. The atmosphere doesn't work that way. Those winds up there, it blows it all around. I just want to give a statistics. Yeah, I really like statistics. to what you said, and that is the average American uses 200 times more energy than the average person in the Congo. And many, to your point, many in America, talk about those Africans just having babies and babies and babies. Well, nobody's having 400 babies. And another relevant thing to what you said, and hasn't been brought up yet, is the one of the many crises among young people. I taught high school for 13 years, and those were some of the best sort of vocational times of my life. One of the crises among young people is the crisis about whether or not they should have family, whether they should bring children into this world. And so I just want to utter those words and in the context of it's a legitimate concern. Yeah. Okay, so let me go on here, and I'm going to, I was tied to my text there because otherwise I'd wander, and now I've already been wandering over the past few minutes, and so I'll sort of use these notes and not use these notes. Let me begin by saying that we need to do 4 things quite explicitly in the context of worship communities. First, clergy need to preach on the climate emergency and on the intersectionality of racial justice, economic justice, and climate justice. And we have to preach as if our lives depend on it, because they do. Second, we need to hear each other's testimony by creating a monthly, as I suggested, or even a weekly opportunity during worship for a member of the congregation to bear witness to an action they or their family are taking to address the climate crisis. Many congregations have begun to take me up on this suggestion. Third, our worship community has to become a place that allows us to process our grief. We're good doing that in terms of funerals and members of our congregation who have passed and supporting one another in that. We need to take those skills and sensitivities and begin to apply them to the loss of our common home and discover what it is, what resources we have in order to help people migrate through this great challenge. And then finally, congregations need to get involved in advocating for and supporting aggressive policies to restore God's creation. I'm not talking about entering into partisan politics. I want to be clear about that. It is right and good for the church, the synagogue, or the mosque to advocate for the restoration of creation, the elimination of racial inequity, and the transformation of economic inequality, right? Okay, so I wanted to just lay out those things. I talked about hope a little bit in there, but I just want to re-emphasize this notion of truth being the foundation of hope. I think all of us are aware, whatever our political persuasions are at the moment, all of us are aware, and also I want to bring in artificial intelligence into this, that we happen to be living in a moment where the very understanding of and notion of and capacity to discern, to distinguish truth from untruth is beginning to be called into question. And I would submit to you that Scripture teaches us that truth is actually the foundation of hope. And that if you are not telling the truth, if you are fabricating something, and as often happens, in the name of trying to give somebody what sometimes masquerades as hope, it has nothing to do with true hope as it is discussed in Scripture. A different way of saying that would be that facing reality is a precondition of hope. Oftentimes, I think, many of us kind of worry, gee, if I face reality, I might lose hope. And if you were to remember one thing from our time together, it would be that facing reality is actually a precondition of hope. Because then, the engagement, when you face reality, the engagement that inspires in you is your testimony to the hope that is driving you to engage. Does that make sense? Yeah. It's not the way hope is often portrayed. Hope is usually portrayed as optimism. And biblical hope has absolutely nothing to do with optimism. Biblical hope really has to do with truth, and often, certainly in Bible stories, that truth is following God's interpretation of things rather than the kind of reality on the ground, I guess, as I would say. What else? So here's a few examples of truths, for example, that I think would be, and certainly when I preach, today I'm talking to you on a Sunday afternoon, but when I preach, these are examples of the kind of truths that I bring into my sermons. Three truths. First, in the 8.5 years since the Paris Climate Agreement, right? That was 8.5 years ago. J.P. Morgan Chase, Citibank, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America, our 4 largest banks in America, have lent over $1 trillion to fossil fuel companies in order to expand their infrastructure, none of which is needed along the lines of what you and I were talking about. But we as a society are not yet capable of that pivot, so the banks are willing to lend the money because it sounds like it's going to continue to be a good deal, as it has been for 100 years, right? All those loans were repaid. So that's truth number one. And we should all be aware of that. Truth number two, the world has no need for more fossil fuel. We've been talking about that a little bit. Truth number three, if our world is to remain livable, if we are to keep the increase in global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius, fossil fuel companies will have to walk away from $100 trillion of profit. So our society needs to create a context in which Exxon, Chevron, and the others can walk away from $100 trillion of profit. That's a tough order. We've never been in that situation before. We walked away from buggies and buggy whips. That, no, I don't think anybody is like languishing in that transition. But that's a truth. We just have to do that. Okay, what else do I want to go to here?
So how do we convince the oil producers that the $100 trillion won't do them any good if they're all dead?
So it's a great question, and it's also, I just want to pick up on exactly what you said, which is it's fiduciarily irresponsible to invest in something that will kill you, right? So all the pension companies that invest in fossil fuel, I have met with many of those boards and said this is fiduciarily irresponsible. And in my book, I talk about a guy who has the best name in the world, right? Ready for the best name you've ever heard? Beavis Longstreet. Right? That's at least a nominee for the best name you've ever heard, right? Beavis Longstreet was nominated by President Reagan to be on the, I'm forgetting the official name of it, the small group that oversees the stock market and all of that. And back in the 1990s, when all of this began to come out, Beavis Longstreet was saying it's irresponsible for pension companies, which have a 40-year outlook, right? It's irresponsible for them to invest in a industry which, if all they do is continue business as usual, will kill the investor. I mean, it sounds funny, but this is like the situation that I'm not finger pointing at anybody, it's we, all of us we've gotten into this mess, right? So, back to your question. How are we going to convince them to walk away from $100 trillion? One, the only concrete suggestion I have ever heard on that is, and I'm sure there are people in the room that know a lot more about this than I do, and that is, in Japan, there is a much closer connection between sort of corporate infrastructure and governmental infrastructure. And somehow it will have to come to pass that these corporations no longer can simply pursue profit at the cost of killing billions of people and transition. And the only thing that will make them do that or be able to do that will be some kind of deal, for lack of a better word, that has, this is the hard part, that has a time horizon longer than 4 years, and that all of America has to come, and not just to the point of China, somebody said, not just all of America, but the whole world. We just have to find a different way. Yeah, so, yeah, okay, the past 4 minutes, my own mind has been blown. Thank you very much for that question. but that's what I've been dealing with this stuff for decades. And if you really get down to brass tacks, it completely blows your mind. How the heck are we going to do this?
Right.
It's not a bad question, but it doesn't mean we don't have to do it. It turns out we do. Yeah, it turns out we do. Okay. Let me offer some concrete opportunities to engage action. I said earlier, and if you walk away with one thing that you're going to take away from this, take away, it's important to talk about climate change. It's a little awkward, socially it might not be something that comes very easily. But as Katharine Hayhoe, who is an evangelical Christian and nowadays I think she's our foremost climate scientist in America, says, talking about climate change may be the most important thing any of us can do. Because that's how and why people make changes, is they hear somebody talking about it, and then it's this kind of thing, we could do this, that kind of thing. Which is also why testimony of, what change have you made in you or your family's life in the context of congregational worship, it's going to produce a lot of those elbows. It would be great, and I know we've already done this for this gathering, but when gatherings like this happen, or when a congregation, initiates a green team or something, to tell your local community through an op-ed piece or radio station or whatever you have here or back home in your local community that you're doing it. Oftentimes, people don't do that. I mentioned this in my talk, but I want to tell you about this new organization. It's now barely 2 years old. Bill McKibben, who's a name that many of you have heard because he wrote the first book on climate change back in the late 80s. He initiated the Youth Climate Movement in 2007, and his organization that he and those young people founded was 350.org. Bill turned 60 2 years ago. There's a few of us in this room that are over 60. And he said, what would happen if elders were to initiate a parallel movement? And he pondered it, and I and a few others helped him ponder it. And he came up with this title, Third Act. So if you just look at the website, Third Act, THIRDACT.org. If you go there, there are so many great suggestions going on there. If you're from Arizona, I'm sure there's an Arizona chapter. If you're from some other state, there are chapters now in, I think, 40 states. There's also a faith chapter, and I'm one of the coordinators of that. So this is an opportunity for those of us who are elders to really engage this issue. Something else that most of us, not all of us, can do is to really join, on a personal basis, join the movement to electrify everything. To really learn enough about what would be the easiest first transition you could make in your home in order to move toward greater electrification. And again, I won't ask for a show of hands here, but if the congregation were a safe enough place where we could talk about this, the kind of thing people would be talking about is installing a heat pump in their house. And you might think, wait, what does that have to do with church, for God's sakes? It has to do with restoring God's creation. Doesn't that qualify for church? I think so. But that's a perfect example of a transition that I'm attempting to make concrete, right, in this second part of my presentation here. What else? I'm just looking at all these notes here. We were talking about either community or region. How is it that the people of Los Angeles County recently made a decision, and I didn't study this enough to be able to tell you, was it a vote that they took, or was it a countywide vote, or was it a city council's kind of thing? But the decision has been made to engage a 20-year process by which they will be closing down. If you've ever driven through LA, you've seen thousands of oil wells, right? The pumpers going like this. They're all going to be closed in 20 years. LA was founded on oil, right? I grew up in Torrance, California. And full confession, ready for the full confession? I worked for 2 summers in my father's oil refinery. My dad was the head chemical engineer for Mobil Oil. Oh yeah. And he would be proud of this work of my life. My brother ended up becoming an environmental scientist, and our dad died a long time ago, but he would have been proud of what both of us have done with our lives. But this is a great example of LA County making a decision to have a 20-year process, so it takes time to make the transition, right? Here's another example. I'm going to read to you something that appeared in the newsletter of the First Methodist Church of Seattle. Okay? Legit, right? Legit church. Got it? Ready? Oh, before I read this is about Costco. All right, show of hands. Who has shopped at Costco? All right. Guess where Costco is based? Seattle. First Methodist Church Seattle in their newsletter. Did you know Costco's credit cards are issued by Citi? one of the dirtiest banks on the planet. City pumps billions into building new oil, coal, and gas projects that are sure to worsen our climate emergency. More than 30% of Americans are Costco, it's a lot more than 30% in this room, are Costco shoppers. The First Church, that's their name, First Church, Climate Justice Group, urges you to tell Costco that it needs to drop Citi as its credit card issuer. Let's urge Costco to do the right thing. Many of you know that's their theme, right? Do the right thing, it's like they wear on their vests. Please share this petition with your friends and family. Again, you can sign up at thirdact.org. Well, 10,000 people signed that petition. I think it was more than 10,000. And the Third Act group in Seattle knocked on the door of the CEO of Costco and handed them the petition. And believe it or not, because this never happens, the CEO said, we're going to look into it. And the urging was to do the better thing, right? To do the right thing, which is Costco's theme. Please.
Yes, I have an action that people do right here in this room right now. Could I ask you to take a look at it?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is a petition for Sedona City government, right? And it lists the government leaders here. And the city of Sedona banks with Wells Fargo. So apparently that's the official bank for your fair city here. Whereas Wells Fargo is the world's top lender of operating capital to the oil and coal and gas and fracking industry. Therefore, we, the undersigned concerned citizens, respectfully demand that the city of Sedona stop doing business with Wells Fargo Bank. You know, I have to say, I've been interrupted in giving presentations a lot. And I have never been interrupted in such a kind and appropriate way. So I'm not going to say that I urge you to like keep going and signing up for this. But I obviously think and want to thank you for this initiative. Oh, you have enough copies. Okay, there are more copies here, and it looks to me like several hundred, if not thousands, of people in Sedona have signed already. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
So this isn't a question as much as
Please.
If there's other people in this room who are doing things, and it might be helpful to leave a few minutes at the end where people can say what they're doing, so we can connect with each other.
Indeed. I'm just. You know, let me give you just one more suggestion, and then at that, I want to hear from each other what you're doing, and that is this. For about 12 years now, I've been working with a nonprofit that started about 12 years ago called Echo America, and what it has been trying to do is to motivate leaders in different arenas of American life to make climate change an important part of their work. And so one of those arenas is the religious arena, right? And so the name of that arena for Echo America is called Blessed Tomorrow. And they are initiating a campaign called One Home, One Future. Once again, the website is easy, one, O-N-E, home, O-N-E, future.org. And if you're from this congregation, what you could do, and I would urge you, just based on our time together today, to just have somebody in your congregation who would be the appropriate person to do this on behalf of the congregation, to contact One Home, One Future and say that you'd like to participate in the One Home, One Future campaign. There are going to be thousands of congregations across the country participating in an April gathering, which is not a physical gathering. It's going to be a Zoom gathering. There's going to be some physical presence. I'm going to be doing an initial opening for that, but there's going to be a whole bunch of other speakers discussing just what we have discussed this afternoon. So I just wanted to get the One Home, One Future thing out there for you. And just let you know, this is an obvious list I'm going to give, but we haven't yet kind of focused on what an individual can do as a person. So here's what I think of as a very obvious list, but it also may raise some questions for you. If you own a home, you can insulate your attic. a lot of people just don't realize what a difference that would make in terms of their energy use. The next time you buy a car or a truck, make it an electric one, or at least a hybrid, or even consider replacing one of your cars with an electric bike. Okay, I've been a cyclist all my life. A couple years ago, I transitioned to an electric bike. It's astonishing. I just want to urge you, if you're like thinking like, you know, we could like do our 1 mile runs instead of in a car and electric bike, especially if you live around a place like this, consider it. How about installing solar panels? I already discussed that example in my own life. How about eating less meat? Okay, maybe not be a vegetarian or a vegan, but how about eating less meat? And I will confess to you, I've been a vegetarian since 1970. Okay, I was the only vegetarian on my college football team. A laughter is completely appropriate. The CRAP that I got from the steak and eggs guys was full. So that's another thing. Eat less meat. You can transition your home from oil or gas to an electric heat pump. That's a big deal. That's hard. I'm in the process. My wife and I are in the process of doing that in our Vermont home. But with each step you take, you know, I installed Nest thermostats a year ago. Has anybody installed Nest thermostats? Yeah, it ain't easy, right? Yeah, getting it, yeah, exactly. Thank you. And as the example from Greta Thunberg and her mom makes, you know, we can fly less. Every time we think about flying, it's good to pause and think, you know, do I really need to do this? Climate scientists are doing this with great frequency, and one of them actually got fired for refusing to fly. Which is like, wait, the climate scientist got fired for refusing to fly because of climate change? But that's where we're living right now, as I think we've made clear by many examples, right? That's where we're living right now. Okay, so let's spend the rest of our time in conversation back and forth. Please, back there.
The biggest concern that I have is that there's not enough people that are concerned about this. And you equate this climate change with World War II. World War II, there was a couple of catastrophic events that changed a lot of people's minds about how they would mobilize this country. I think it's going to take a catastrophic event to get the majority of the people in this country to jump on board, like ocean levels rising and half of New York City being underwater. And then people will pay attention. Because it's the politicians that have to see it in their interest to be the people that make the change, just like it did mobilizing for World War II.
So thank you for the comment. I have spent hours and maybe even days of my life pondering exactly what you said. And I know enough about science to say that the likelihood of, like, there have been several movies alleged about climate change, you know, where New York City is underwater and things like that. And I think everybody in the room is aware that it's not the likelihood of a sudden incident like that will capture our attention.
Oh, I know it won't be a sudden.
And I know you know that. But the thing is, we're wired in such a way that it seems like, geez, it's going to take that, and yet that won't be it. The thing I worry about most, I very rarely say this to an audience, but I'm glad you raised it. The thing I worry about most is the human capacity to essentially adjust to incremental change. I'm making essentially the same point you made.
And I think that's true, but to get everybody on board to make those incremental changes, I hear statistics about we have to do certain things by the next 10 years or it's going to be too late. You can't go back.
So I'm really glad you just said that, because it turns out with this challenge, there's no such thing as too late. It's always the case that taking action, and this will be true 10 years from now and 20 years from now, no matter what happens during those 10 or 20 years, it will always be the case that it is not too late to take action, and by taking action, that will improve circumstances for our children and grandchildren and future generations. That's a reality. Now, whether we can take sufficient action, which was the point of really, how do you get enough people on board to have the actions be sufficient? And the earlier comment about China and India, to get enough countries on board to make, that's the challenge. And there is no Pearl Harbor coming.
Well, I don't think so either.
Yeah.
But it has to be something that affects a lot of people.
Well, it is the case now that more and more people are recognizing climate change is personally affecting their life, or if you ask them, or the lives of somebody you know, you get numbers like 80% of people will say it's affected my life or someone I know. So, for example, all of you, I'm sure, must, wherever you live, heard about the flooding we had in Vermont. And it essentially took out our capital. Our capital is Montpelier, you know? And it's down in the bottom of this valley, and there's a river right there, and it's been there for 250 years. And they have to relocate all the federal offices there, all the state offices there. It's like, wait a minute, really? Yes. Yeah, and these offices, they have to relocate, and I don't mean literally physically move the building. They have to, they're trying to figure out this. It's like $150 million of damage in the little town of Montpelier, Vermont. But in Vermont, I don't want to say everyone knows it was climate change, but pretty much everyone knows it was climate change that prompted that. So it's happening. It's impacting. Here and about. Another question, please. Yes.
So your definition a little while ago between hope and optimism got me thinking about it. First of all, I think there's hundreds of brilliant men and women walking around in the globe today. And my hope, or maybe optimism, was somebody figure out how to do this. I saw a news broadcast within the last year of scientists someplace in Iceland or Greenland who had built a mechanism removing CO2 from the air.
Iceland, yes.
Iceland. It was a small deal. I mean, it wasn't big enough to take care of the problem, obviously. But am I on the hope side or the optimistic side here? What's out there coming scientifically from people who are working on this problem?
Okay, so wasn't that a lovely question? Yeah. Yes, wasn't that? And so first, it's Iceland. Second, the qualification that you said is exactly right. The Science Now and that project, and there are numerous similar projects, are how shall I put this? Unless there was breakthrough after breakthrough after breakthrough after breakthrough, they are not promising. And the reason is because they can't do anything to scale. So the project in Iceland has removed enough CO2 from the air to be the equivalent of something like taking 100 cars off the road, as opposed to the hundreds of millions of cars throughout the world that are on the road. Now, please don't think that there he goes again. Don't let that go into your mind when I say what I'm about to say. But guess who is funding these projects?
Oh.
Oil companies.
Oh.
And that's because the oil companies want credit for trying to remove carbon from the atmosphere, and they want long-term capacity to continue doing what they're doing, because we're working on removing the carbon from the atmosphere. And I'm not exaggerating this. So I've been a speaker at the Arctic Convention, which is the countries that border the Arctic have been getting together each year for the past 15 years, except for 2 years during COVID. And they talk about, among others, Iceland hosts this, and they talk about all the relevant things about their future, because you may have heard that Iceland also had a funeral for for a glacier that vanished, right? And so they are really conscious up there in Scandinavia about these things. And the vast majority of the people and organizations attending these conferences are fossil fuel companies. who are, attempting to maintain their hold on the Bering Sea, the oil coming out of the Bering Sea, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So now I want to really answer your question about hope and optimism. What I am insanely optimistic about are batteries. And batteries are the key to being able to electrify everything. And it turns out batteries are some of you have heard about Moore's Law, where the capacity of the computer doubles every, Moore had a couple different versions, every year and a half, roughly. And back when we were young and we bought our first computer, that was huge, and then it turns out you could get one half the size that would have the same power, and then you could get one a quarter the size that would have 5 times that power. And when the reason Neil Armstrong took over for landing the lunar module was because the computer in the Apollo spacecraft was about the size of the computer in my watch. You all know that? And of course a human was better than that stupid watch. and the reason the most recent one, like 3 weeks ago, fell on its side was because there was no human to see that, oh, there's a rock there. I think I'll move it 6 inches in that direction. Batteries is the biggest and best answer to your question. And what's going to happen in our lifetime is that the capacity of batteries to provide electrical storage for all the power humanity needs, it's increasing at a pace that is unimaginable. So, like 3 years ago, they were saying, we might get to 300 miles a charge for your car battery by 2030. And now it's actually going to be 2025 and it's going to be 500 miles. That's how fast the science is moving. Final comment on batteries, because no one's asked about lithium or cobalt or the other rare minerals, but I see several heads nodding. And it turns out the vast majority of that, like 85% of that, is recyclable. So all it takes is humans to say, oh yeah, it's not just enough to invent the thing and then to build the thing, we also have to reuse the thing. We have to reuse the thing. And it's not enough to say to those poor people in Congo, basically we're going to keep raping your earth. It's not enough to do that. We have to reuse those things. And that's another part of the Greta Thunberg, we have to change everything. Because I'm sure it's not news to everybody here that the recycling of plastics now, I don't want to say it's a joke. It's a joke. Yeah. And why do we put up with that? Why do we put up with that? And also, it's related to what I just said about it being a joke, is related to the pivot that the oil industry is making, recognizing that there are conversations like this going on. They're making a pivot from fossil fuels to plastic. Because I'm sure most of you know that plastics come from fossil fuel, right? And so if plastics become more essential, then maybe that $100 trillion goes down to only $80 trillion. I don't know, I'm making that number up. But you understand the logic behind it. Oh, yes, another question, please.
If the technology is moving that fast in the world of batteries, why wouldn't that technology be moving that fast in the example I gave a moment ago about removing the carbon from the air with the mechanism in Iceland?
Yeah, thank you for following up on that. So, like I said, I have a strong science background, and I know the limit of my science background. And I have enough science to say that from what I have read, which has been several technical articles, it really doesn't look promising. It's possible to do this, to extract it from the air, but the amount of energy needed to transport that amount of air through the machines that have the capacity to suck the CO2 out, the amount of energy is more than the gain of getting the CO2 out. So, why Iceland? Because Iceland has an unlimited amount of energy right below its feet, right? All that volcano stuff. So the reason it works in ice and still doesn't work very well, as you said, is because they have an unlimited amount of energy to fuel whatever that machine is that they have. And one other thing, they have, I think it's basalt, I'm not exactly sure what the rock is, down below in the caves, and they pump the CO2 down into this certain rock that then the air CO2 solidifies and becomes part of the rock structure. And there's like 3 places in the world that have that combination of unlimited volcanic energy with the right rock formation where you can transition the CO2 from atmospheric to solid.
Okay, thanks.
So yeah, it's a limited possibility. Now, I've called on you twice already, so I have back here, thank you.
It sounds like what you said, a lot of this, and it goes toward electricity. And what you also mentioned, we should be moving more toward electricity. And yet, what I read about and have read over the last several years is in terms of our electric grid nationwide, it has problems. Are we making simultaneous improvements to our grid to be able to handle all this electricity?
So if you didn't hear, the question is about the grid. Is the electric grid in America prepared for the transition to electrify everything? And the flat out answer to that is absolutely not, first. Second, because you asked the right question, like somebody working on it or something like that. And the answer to that is yes, but the whole, what I think the best sort of framework to put this in is utilities. And the whole, electrical utility thing, because it is oddly both private and public, right? We all totally depend on it, and yet it's private corporations, in most cases, not all, that benefit from it and do it, for a profit, which is completely understandable. What's the motive for them to prepare for quadruple usage or 100-fold increase in usage? What's the motive for that?
Money.
And if we could somehow monetize the transition, which is what we need to do, and maybe you can help with this, the accountant sitting next to we, that would be not just America, but the world actually, have to find a way to monetize that transition. And no, that's not easy. Yes, it's big picture. Can it be done? If you look at, and I know this will sound antiquated to many of you, but if you look at the initial transition to electrified towns back in the 1870s to 1910s, it's just astonishing how fast that happened. If you look at the color TVs, America's embrace of color TVs, from roughly 1956 to 1963, in the course of like 4 of those years, I don't remember exactly which years it was, but late 50s, early 60s, in the course of 4 years, 60% of TVs went from, or 100% TVs, 60% of those became color TVs in the course of 4 years. Because people want to like color, So are we capable of making that kind of transition? Absolutely. Will we? And is there the motive, which is really what's behind your question? We have to create it. Yeah. Somebody else had a question. Yes?
Can you please repeat the word that you said was sadness over loss of a place?
Oh, the word is solastalgia. It's like nostalgia, like being nostalgic for the loss of something, but solastalgia is the loss of a place you call home. So it could literally be your home, like if you live in Mount Gilead, Vermont, or it could be that you visited someplace when you were a kid and then you went back there, 20 or 30 or 40 years later, and something really major had taken it away.
Sedona,
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know enough about your community and how it has changed, but maybe there's a little solastalgia floating around here for people that have been here or visited here for decades, yeah. Okay, we're near 5 o'clock.
Okay.
So first question and last question, what do you
Yeah,
think?
I'm sorry.
Please.
You asked what are some of the things that are happening, and I would suggest that in our UCC denomination, and I know as I went online, other denominations are doing this too, there is a climate justice program that we can become a part of. It was very similar to, oh darn, Margaret, I'm
Open
thinking.
and affirming.
Open and affirming. It has to go through church council, it has to do that sort of thing. But it has steps in there about how to become a congregation that's focused on what can we do to change what we're doing.
Yes, you're
And-
exactly right.
Yeah, and I would suggest that when you get done with the solar thing, you can always go to, that they're perfect for the green team. And then what can you do here? And then what can you take home? I mean, it's just cyclical in
Yeah.
that way.
And you're making these steps as you just outlined in this congregation. You can also connect with other congregations here in Sedona and encourage them to do likewise. Yeah.